A stray dog led a veteran to a hidden mountain fortress. What they found inside changed everything people said. Ethan Cole survived the war by luck. But the truth was stranger. Because the only reason he's alive today is a wounded stray German shepherd who crossed a blizzard, broke every instinct of self-preservation, and dragged him into a secret his best friend died trying to expose. Most veterans talk about the day they lost everything. Ethan talks about the night a dog returned it, and nothing that followed should have been possible. The wind came first, a long, low moan rolling down from the saw-tooth peaks like something ancient had just woken up. By nightfall it had become a full blizzard, a white wall beating against the crooked cabin where Ethan Cole sat alone, watching the last thread of his world come apart. The foreclosure notice lay on the table, its clean government font mocking the mess he had become. 6 years of trying to live with PTSD, trying to outrun the memory of a firefight that stole his closest friend, had left him with nothing but this splintered cabin, a faded duffel, and a silence that hurt more than any wound he'd carried back from the Middle East. He didn't hear the storm anymore. He only heard Mason Ward's voice, as clear as it had been the day they were ambushed. Mason laughing through tension. Mason telling him not to overthink it. Mason telling him he'd always have his back. Then gunfire. Then the sound Ethan could never forget. Tonight, he'd decided he was done fighting ghosts. The candle on the table flickered when he reached for the rifle propped by the door. Not because he needed it, but because he didn't want to feel anything when he stepped out into the cold. The wind would take care of the rest. Peace, finally. Silence. Then he heard it. A scrape. Faint. Quick. Almost swallowed by the blizzard. His first thought was that it was the storm playing tricks on him. Snow sliding off the roof. A loose shutter. His mind creating one last distraction before he walked out. But it came again. A deliberate sound. A pause. Then a low, strained whine. Ethan froze. That sound didn't belong to the storm. It belonged to something alive. Something in trouble. He crossed the room before he even realized he was moving. Old instincts were faster than grief. He unlatched the door and pulled it open a few inches. The wind punched through the gap in a violent gust, but it wasn't the cold that stole his breath. It was the dog. A German shepherd, soaked to the bone, half collapsed on his doorstep. His coat was a mix of silver and black, thick with ice, and one of his paws lifted painfully off the ground. Yet his eyes, those sharp amber eyes, were locked onto Ethan with a focus that felt unnatural, intentional. It wasn't the look of an animal begging for shelter. It was the look of a soldier reporting for duty. Ethan knelt, hand steadying the dog's broad shoulders, feeling the tremor of exhausted muscles and the slow, ragged breath. The shepherd didn't flinch. He didn't growl or shy away. He met Ethan's gaze with calm recognition, as if this moment had always been part of some mission only he understood. Something brushed against Ethan's fingers. A collar, not store-bought. He recognized it instantly. Paracord. Hand-woven. King Cobra stitch. Their unit's signature project during downtime. Mason's collar. Ethan's chest tightened. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't trust what he was seeing. Mason had made only 2 of these, one for his own dog, one as a joke for later. The second had burned in the explosion. He'd seen it himself. So how was this here? He lifted the shepherd's head gently, checking the weave by touch, just to be sure. The texture hit him like a punch. This wasn't a copy. It was the original. The knots were identical, tight in the way Mason tied them when he was trying to stay awake on long nights. The world tilted, the storm outside, the foreclosure letter, Mason's voice echoing in his head. None of it mattered compared to this impossible truth lying on his floor. Ethan dragged the shepherd inside and shut the door against the howling wind. The dog slumped onto the wooden planks, chest rising in slow, determined breaths. Not helpless, not afraid, just waiting. Ethan grabbed a towel and water, his movements automatic. The shepherd drank with controlled urgency, then lifted his head again, amber eyes fixed on Ethan as if assessing him. Not judging, not pleading, recruiting. Ethan sat back on his heels. The cabin felt different now. The silence suddenly charged, alive, as if the room itself was holding its breath. This dog didn't wander here. He'd been sent. Ethan stared at the paracord collar again, his stomach twisting. Mason had been killed 6 years ago. Killed in an ambush the command insisted was unavoidable. But Mason had been careful, paranoid even, always double-checking intel, always suspecting there was more behind that mission than anyone admitted. Ethan had tried to forget those doubts. He'd tried to silence the questions. He'd tried to blame himself instead because guilt was easier than believing in betrayal. But now a dog wearing Mason's collar had crossed a lethal blizzard and found his door in the middle of nowhere. There were no coincidences like this. Ethan touched the dog's head, feeling the strength under the thick fur. The shepherd closed his eyes briefly, leaning into the gesture before pulling back just enough to sit upright. Then, without warning, he stood. In one smooth, deliberate motion, he walked to the cabin door and waited. Ethan's breath fogged in the cold air as he stared at the dog's silhouette against the storm-lit wood. The shepherd didn't whine, didn't bark, didn't move. He simply looked over his shoulder with an expression Ethan had only ever seen on trained canines in combat zones. "Follow me." Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears. Something inside him, something he thought had died the day Mason did, stirred. Purpose. He rose slowly, hands shaking. Not from fear, not from the cold. From the realization that the past he'd been running from for 6 years had just walked back through his door, and it had 4 legs. Ethan reached for his parka, shrugged it on, and took one last look at the foreclosure letter on the table. Then he crushed it in his fist and tossed it into the fire. The flames caught instantly, devouring the last piece of the life he'd been clinging to. When he opened the cabin door again, the blizzard roared, swallowing the warm air in a single breath. The shepherd didn't hesitate. Ethan stepped out after him. The storm closed behind them, like the curtain on an old world that no longer mattered. For most of the night, the storm battered the cabin as if trying to reclaim the stray that had slipped from its grasp. Ethan barely slept. Every time his eyes closed, he saw that paracord collar. Mason's hands weaving the knots. Mason telling him that every pattern had a purpose. Now the collar sat on a living dog that should not exist in his world anymore. By dawn, the worst of the blizzard had passed, leaving a pale blue light slipping through the frosted window. The shepherd lay curled near the fireplace, his breathing slow and even. The ice had melted from his coat, revealing scars Ethan recognized immediately. Not accidents, not from fights with wildlife. Combat scars. The kind dogs only got in one kind of life. Ethan crouched beside him. "You walked through hell to get here," he murmured. The dog opened his eyes. Amber! Alert! Too focused for an animal that had nearly frozen to death the night before. Ethan reached for a tin bowl, filled it with water again, and slid it closer. The shepherd drank with disciplined, measured gulps, then rose to his feet. Not sluggish, not weak, recovered far too quickly. Ethan blinked in disbelief. "That's not normal." The dog stepped toward him, then toward the door, then back to him again. A precise movement, a command. Ethan recognized it instantly. He'd seen dogs trained for military operations use almost the exact same cue. "Follow." He stood slowly, unsure whether to be impressed or terrified. The shepherd watched him with a patience that didn't read as canine eagerness, but something closer to calculation. a partner waiting for a teammate to fall in line. "You're not a stray," Ethan whispered. "Who trained you?" The dog held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned to the door again, stiffened his posture, and gave one sharp movement of his head. Time to move. The storm outside still roared in bursts, rattling the window and sending loose snow across the pane. Ethan felt the weight of the world pushing back against him. He didn't want to leave the cabin. He didn't want to face the memories waiting in the storm. He didn't want to confront the truth that Mason might have known. Something so dangerous, so explosive, that even death hadn't stopped his plan from reaching Ethan's doorstep. For 6 years, Ethan had lived by one rule: stay invisible. And here was a dog dragging him back into a world where rules got men killed. He sank into the old wooden chair, rubbing his temples. The shepherd approached him, pressed his head into Ethan's knee. Not affection. Pressure, a grounding force, the way trained canines steady their handlers during panic episodes. Ethan froze. "How do you know that?" he whispered. The dog stepped back, sat, and waited. Ethan looked at the foreclosure notice still sitting on the floor where he had dropped it last night. One crisp corner still untouched by the fire. His name printed at the top. His failures laid out in black ink. He could stay. Let the world take the cabin. Let the storm take him next. Let time erase him the way it had erased soldiers before him. But Mason's collar was lying 5 feet away on a dog that should not know any of this. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing to the door and back again. "Why me? Why now?" He gestured toward the storm. "If there's something out there, why bring it to me? You should have died in that blizzard." The shepherd tilted his head. Ethan wasn't sure if the silence that followed was an answer or the absence of one. But something inside him cracked open. The part of him that had once run toward gunfire, toward danger, toward missions that didn't make sense until they did. That part whispered to him now. "Move." He opened the small closet by the door, pulling out the gear he hadn't touched in years. His insulated parka, the cold weather boots, the tactical gloves, the backpack with half-forgotten essentials. Each item carried a memory he wanted to bury but couldn't. The shepherd rose, tail still, body poised. As Ethan zipped the parka, the dog approached and nudged the lower strap with his nose. It needed tightening. Another trained behavior. Ethan adjusted it, swallowing hard. "Okay, Ranger." The dog's ears perked slightly at the name. Acceptance, identification. As if he had simply been waiting for Ethan to speak it aloud. He was Ranger now, and he was ready. Ethan took the foreclosure notice, the last tie to the life he was supposed to have had. He walked to the fireplace and tossed it in. The paper curled and blackened instantly, eaten by the flames until nothing remained but ash. A life ended without ceremony. Ranger moved to the door again, lifted his paw, and placed it against the wood, as if knocking. Ethan pulled the latch. Cold air exploded inward, the tail end of the blizzard slashing across his face. Snow whipped horizontal lines across the clearing outside, and visibility was barely a few yards. Ranger didn't hesitate. He stepped into the white, head lowered against the wind. Ethan's heart hammered once in his chest, hard enough to feel in his ribs. Then he followed the dog into the storm. A plot twist came faster than the cold could reach him. As soon as Ethan stepped off the porch, Ranger lunged forward and stopped abruptly, staring to the right. Ethan followed his gaze. Tracks. Fresh. Not the dog's. Not Ethan's. Boot prints. Deep. Wide. Military tread pattern, headed straight toward the ridge behind the cabin. Someone else had been here during the storm. Someone close. Ethan felt the old instincts sharpen inside him like a blade being pulled from a sheath. Whoever they were, Ranger had either evaded them or outrun them. and now the dog was guiding Ethan directly into their shadow. The storm swallowed their figures as they moved into the trees, Ranger leading with the confidence of an animal who knew the terrain better than any map ever could. Ethan followed, each step sinking deeper into a mission he had not chosen but could no longer walk away from. And somewhere far ahead, buried in the white silence of the mountains, waited the truth Mason died for. The storm thinned as Ranger cut through the forest with the confidence of an animal who knew every bend, every slope, every danger long before it came into view. Ethan followed, boots sinking into fresh snow, lungs burning in the frigid air. Yet he felt more awake than he had in years. Not comfortable, not safe, but alive. Ranger moved with a precision Ethan hadn't seen since his Marine days. The dog avoided open clearings, hugged the shadows of thick pines, and used the natural dips of the terrain to stay hidden. Several times he stopped abruptly, ears pricking toward the wind, scanning for threats Ethan couldn't yet feel. This wasn't how strays traveled. This was a route chosen with intent, a reconnaissance path, a tactical approach. Ethan tried to ignore the boot prints they'd spotted earlier, but they were burned into the back of his mind. Someone else had been near the cabin. Someone trained. Someone close enough to know Ranger's presence mattered. Each step pushed him deeper into a realization he wasn't ready for. Whatever thread Ranger carried from Mason's past, it wasn't small. It wasn't personal. It was dangerous enough that someone else was looking for it. Ranger paused again at the edge of a frozen river. The ice was thick, white, unbroken. Instead of crossing, the dog padded upstream, following the curve of the water until it narrowed into a canyon walled by jagged stone. Snow swirled through the tight space like a living thing. Ethan hesitated. The path ahead looked impossible. Too narrow. Too treacherous. "You sure about this?" he muttered. Ranger answered by leaping onto a narrow ledge just wide enough for his paws. He looked back once, as if checking Ethan's resolve, then pressed forward. Ethan gritted his teeth and followed. It took everything he had not to slip. Ice clung to the rock face, and snow had gathered in deceptive patches, hiding the limits of the path. Twice his boots nearly lost traction. Twice Ranger paused and waited, giving him the silent room to recover. The dog was not just leading him, he was guarding him. After nearly a mile of treacherous terrain, the canyon widened abruptly. The wind died. The silence that replaced it was cavernous, heavy. Ethan stepped into a clearing and faced a massive granite wall rising like the spine of the mountain itself. A dead end. Ranger walked straight toward it. "Hold on," Ethan said, breath fogging. "There's nothing here." Ranger didn't break stride. He pressed his nose to the rock, sniffed along its base, then found a specific stone nestled in the wall, a stone indistinguishable from the others to any human eye. Ranger lifted his right paw and pressed. Ethan expected nothing. Instead, he heard a soft mechanical click deep inside the stone. The ground vibrated under his boots. A faint line of light traced itself across the rock face, forming a perfect rectangle. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought the mountain was cracking open. Then the seam widened with a hydraulic hiss. The granite wall retracted inward, revealing a steel door thick enough to withstand a missile. It slid open, releasing a wash of warm, filtered air that smelled faintly of ozone and old insulation. A golden glow spilled out across the snow. Ethan staggered backward. "No way." Ranger stepped inside without hesitation. Ethan looked into the glowing passageway. Smooth metal floors, industrial lighting, a corridor leading to something far bigger than he could comprehend. This wasn't a survival shelter. This was a military-grade installation. His pulse spiked. The last time he'd seen architecture like this, he was half a world away, standing inside a NATO facility carved into a mountain in Norway. But this wasn't Norway. This was Idaho. He felt a cold ripple of dread chase up his spine. "Mason, what did you do?" He stepped through the door. The steel slammed shut behind him, sealing out the storm with a final thud that echoed through the metal corridor. The world outside disappeared. It felt like stepping into another reality. Ranger trotted ahead, tail low, posture steady, guiding him deeper. The corridor opened into a circular chamber the size of a small apartment. A bunk with crisp grey sheets, a kitchenette with stainless counters, shelves stocked with food rations and medical supplies, and dominating the far wall, a semicircle of computer monitors and military-grade communication gear. Everything was spotless, organized, running on standby power. Someone lived here, prepared here, planned here, and Ethan didn't have to guess who. The handwriting on the labeled supply bins hit him first, the sharp, compact lettering. Mason's writing. He'd seen it on field notes, mission plans, quick messages scribbled on notepads to boost morale. Ethan stepped closer, heart pounding. One of the monitors flickered as if sensing movement. Lines of code flashed across the display. Error messages, corrupt directories, system failures. Then the screen went black. A single blinking cursor appeared in the corner. Waiting. Ranger walked to the ergonomic chair in front of the console and sat, not lying down, sitting upright, watching the screen, watching Ethan, waiting for him to take his position. Mason had trained this dog to do one thing: lead someone to this place, not anyone, not chance. Ethan. His knees felt weak. He lowered himself into the chair, hand trembling as it hovered over the keyboard. "This is impossible." The dog nudged his elbow. Firm. Focus. Ethan pressed a key. The cursor jumped. A directory opened. Hidden files, encrypted folders, logs, digital fragments that felt like whispers from Mason himself. Then something happened that twisted Ethan's insides. A notification window slid onto the screen. New message recovered. Mason, ward log entry del Warwanden. Ethan stared as the first frame of a video flickered to life. Mason sat in this same chair, exhaustion carved into his face, his eyes burning with urgency and fear. Ranger lifted his head, ears bending forward, as if recognizing the image of his first handler. Ethan felt the room shrink around him, felt his breath tighten, felt every defense he'd built over 6 years collapse in an instant. He wasn't losing his mind. Mason had left this for him. Everything suddenly clicked with a force that felt physical. The dog, the collar, the boot prints near the cabin, the hidden bunker. Mason hadn't died by accident. He'd been silenced, and he had left Ranger and this fortress to deliver the truth to the only person he trusted to finish the fight. Ethan's fingertips pressed into the desk as a low, electric dread pulsed through him. He had not followed the dog. The dog had been following Mason's orders, and now Ethan was exactly where Mason had needed him to be, in the belly of a mountain, staring at the first clue of a conspiracy that had cost his best friend his life. For a long moment, Ethan just stared at the frozen frame of Mason on the screen. His best friend looked older than the day he died, as if the camera had captured every hour of paranoia and exhaustion that had led him here. Ranger sat beside the chair, posture straight, eyes fixed on the screen as if ready to receive orders. Ethan swallowed hard and hit play. The video sputtered, its audio crackling with digital decay. Mason leaned closer, voice low but steady. "If you're watching this, Ethan, it means the mission didn't go the way Command briefed, and it means I didn't make it out." Ethan's chest tightened. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Mason continued, "I know what they told you, what they told everyone, but you need to understand something. That day wasn't bad intel. It wasn't a tactical mistake." Static swallowed his next words. The screen fractured into lines of corrupted pixels. Ethan's fingers flew over the keyboard, working through Mason's storage directories. Much of the drive was damaged, but not beyond repair. He used old military data, recovery tools he hadn't touched in years, patching fragments into something readable. One by one, files came back to life. Documents, memos, screenshots, audio recordings, Atlas Dominion. The name appeared again and again, stamped across contracts, email headers, encrypted internal reports. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Atlas was one of the largest private military contractors in the country. They trained foreign units. They did drone work. They handled intel transfers between allied nations. They were everywhere, and Mason had been investigating them. Ethan clicked another video file. Mason appeared again, this time sitting farther back, looking over his shoulder once as if sensing danger. "They sold us out, Ethan," he said. "That ambush wasn't random. Our route, our timing, our loadout, they knew everything, and they traded it for cash." Ethan's throat closed. He remembered the day too clearly. Remembered Mason dragging him behind cover when the first RPG slammed into the convoy. Remembered the shockwave, the ringing, the sudden darkness. He had always suspected something felt off. Too precise, too efficient. But command had shut it down with the same two words. Fog of war. Mason leaned forward again. "I found proof. Not enough to go public, not yet, but enough that Atlas started hunting. I had to disappear. I had to hide everything I learned." The screen glitched. Ranger's ears twitched at the static. Ethan muttered under his breath, "Come on, Mason. Finish the thought." He patched another corrupted block. The video jumped ahead. Mason looked more distressed now, sweat lining his forehead. Behind him, the bunker lights flickered. "I can't trust anyone in the chain anymore. Not one damn soul. Except you." Ethan exhaled slowly, pain pricking beneath his ribs. Mason nodded as if talking directly to him. "You were always the one who asked the right questions, the one who didn't just follow an order because someone higher up said so. That's why I picked you." The room tilted. Ranger shifted closer, pressing against Ethan's leg. Not comforting him, bracing him. Mason took a shaky breath. "This next part is important. They'll kill me before I can bring this to the surface. I know that now. So I trained a fallback." He turned the camera slightly, and a small shepherd puppy stumbled into view. Its ears were too big for its head, its paws clumsy on the metal floor. But even through grainy footage, Ethan recognized the puppy's eyes. Amber. Sharp. Ranger. Mason scratched the puppy gently behind the ear. "He's smart. Smarter than any dog I've worked with. If they take me out, he'll take you the rest of the way." Ethan's breath caught. Ranger looked at the screen, head tilting with a faint recognition, as though remembering the moment he'd been given a purpose he'd spent years waiting to fulfill. The video glitched again. Ethan scrambled to repair the file, fingers shaking now from a mix of anger and disbelief. When the image returned, Mason's tone had changed. "I tried to warn Command. I tried to push this up the chain. But someone inside is blocking everything. Atlas is deeper in this than anyone understands." Outside the bunker, a distant rumble echoed, something heavy shifting inside the mountain. Ethan ignored it, focused entirely on Mason's face. His friend reached into his vest and pulled out a drive. "This is the original data set. If they find it, they'll bury it. So I buried it first." He tapped the console. "Encrypted, fragmented, spread across the whole system. Only one person can reconstruct it." Ethan felt the answer forming before Mason said it. "You." The word landed like a hammer. Mason glanced down, voice softening. "And if something happens to me, Ranger knows the route. He knows when to leave. He knows how to find you." Ethan looked at the dog sitting beside him. Older now, larger, hardened by time, but unmistakably the same pup in the video. Purpose radiated off him. He wasn't just reacting to instinct, he was reacting to memory. The file skipped again. The edges of the screen darkened. Mason's voice grew urgent. "They're closing in. I don't have long. Listen carefully. If you're watching this, don't trust any official line. Don't alert anyone. Don't tell command. They'll send a retrieval team, but they're not here to help." A metal clatter echoed behind Mason in the recording. He snapped around, eyes widening. "Find the truth, Ethan, and finish what I couldn't." The lights behind him shut off. Heavy footsteps thundered through the bunker. Mason slammed a button on the console. The video distorted into garbled pixels. Ethan leaned forward. "Come on, just one more second." The audio broke through for a final phrase. "Don't let them turn my death into a lie." Then the screen went black. Ethan sat frozen, the weight of the bunker settling around him like a verdict. Ranger nudged his elbow again, firmer this time. A reminder that the story didn't end there, that he wasn't alone, that Mason's trust hadn't been misplaced. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the old guilt shift into something sharper. Not grief, responsibility. He opened the next folder. If Mason had died for this, Ethan would find out why. And Ranger, the dog who had crossed a storm carrying the last piece of Mason's legacy, was ready to lead him the rest of the way. The deeper Ethan dug, the more the bunker seemed to hum with a low electric tension, as if the mountain itself knew he was getting close to something he wasn't supposed to see. Ranger stayed pressed at his side, alert, pacing occasionally when Ethan opened a new corrupted directory or forced an encrypted archive to reveal a sliver of data. Most of the files pointed to one name, one operation, Project Black Summit. The folder appeared at first like a ghost directory, present but unreadable. Every time Ethan tried to access it, the system threw errors that felt deliberately engineered rather than accidental. Mason had sealed these files with layers of encryption even military-grade software struggled to break, which meant whatever was inside had been dangerous enough for Mason to bury it under digital concrete. Ethan cracked his knuckles, exhaled, and began the process. Ranger stepped closer, watching him with the stillness of a sentry. The dog had barely blinked since the Mason videos, as if he knew the moment Ethan unlocked this, everything would change. Ethan typed a command, bypassed the first lock, then used an old authentication protocol he hadn't thought about in years. His heartbeat climbed as he patched into a secure military relay, something he shouldn't have had access to anymore, something that would leave a trace. He hesitated. Connecting would be the same as lighting a flare in enemy territory. But didn't he owe Mason more than hesitation? He looked down at the dog. Ranger didn't move, didn't express doubt. His amber eyes held one message. Move forward. Ethan swallowed hard and pressed enter. A soft whir ran through the command station as the system linked with the dormant server in the bunker. A progress bar appeared, filling in slow pulses, like a heartbeat dragging itself back from the edge. 20%, 40, 60. Ethan leaned back, shaking out his hands. "Mason, what were you trying to warn us about?" Ranger stiffened suddenly. His ears rose. His head snapped toward the entrance tunnel. Ethan froze. "What is it?" Ranger didn't bark. He didn't need to. Every muscle in his body had gone tense. Something outside, something moving. Ethan stood, adrenaline firing. The storm had passed, but the mountain had been too quiet since morning. No wind, no shifting snow, no wildlife. Something was off. Before he could investigate, the system beeped, sharp, high-pitched, insistent. The download hit 90%, 95, 100. The encrypted file cracked open, rows of documents, images, signatures, financial transfers. Everything Mason had died trying to expose suddenly filled the screen in brutal clarity. A contract between Atlas Dominion and an unnamed foreign militia group. Coordinates of Allied convoys sold for cash. A list of officers in the chain of command whose silence had been bought. And at the top, Project Black Summit status. Active objective. Redirect U.S. tactical operations for profit. Ethan felt heat rise inside his chest, a slow-burning fury that drowned out the cold. Mason hadn't been chasing paranoia. He had uncovered treason dressed as strategy. This was enough to bury Atlas Dominion and anyone tied to them. Enough to rewrite the official report that had called Mason's death unavoidable. Enough to get Ethan killed for opening it. He didn't have time to process it. Alarms erupted through the bunker in a harsh mechanical scream. Ranger barked once, a sharp, commanding alert. On the monitors, motion trackers lit up like a spreading infection. Red dots advancing down the canyon, another group flanking from the south ridge, a third pushing toward the rear ventilation shaft. Ethan's blood ran cold. "They found us!" Ranger growled deep in his throat, the kind of sound that belonged to a trained K-9 preparing for a threat. Ethan checked the system logs. The moment he connected to the server, a silent trigger had gone out. An alert built into one of Atlas's corrupted files. They had set a trap inside the data, knowing someone would eventually try to unlock it. It wasn't just any team heading toward him. It was a retrieval squad. And they were close. Shadows flickered on one of the cameras. Figures in winter camo, rifles slung across their chests, moving with tactical precision. This was no rescue unit. This was a kill team. Ethan slammed a fist on the desk. "Damn it, Mason!" Ranger barked again, this time backing up toward the inner corridor, urging Ethan to move. "I know," Ethan breathed. "We can't stay here." He pulled the drive from the console, pocketed it, and shut down the terminal. The bunker lights flickered as backup systems switched on automatically. Mason had built this place to survive the unthinkable, but not to resist a coordinated extraction force. The mountain trembled as something heavy hit the outer door. Ethan's pulse spiked. "They brought breaching charges." Ranger sprinted into the main passage and looked back. Ethan followed. Another explosion rattled the steel frame. Dust rained from the ceiling. Ranger bounded ahead, guiding him deeper into the bunker. They passed rooms Ethan hadn't explored yet. Storage bays, a maintenance alcove, a generator chamber humming with old power. When they reached a narrow, sub-level hatch, Ranger stopped and nudged the handle with his nose. "A secondary exit," Ethan whispered. Ranger pawed the hatch again, urgent. Ethan turned the wheel. The hatch unlocked and swung open, releasing a gust of freezing air. A steep, icy tunnel sloped downward into darkness. Suddenly the lights dimmed. The bunker door camera blinked. Black silhouettes filled the entry corridor. They were inside. Ethan's breath hitched. There was no time left. He dropped into the tunnel, gripping the icy handholds as Ranger leapt down beside him with perfect balance. Above them, the echo of boots thundered through the bunker. Voices barked orders. Someone shouted for thermal sweeps. Ethan and Ranger slid deeper into the mountain's throat. The tunnel angled sharply, spitting them out behind a curtain of frozen moss into a narrow ravine hidden between towering slabs of granite. Snow had drifted deep here, untouched, pristine. The perfect place to disappear. Ranger turned his head back towards the bunker. Ethan did too. Smoke was beginning to leak from the ventilation shaft. They were burning the evidence. Ranger pressed against Ethan's leg, steady, grounded, reminding him of the truth. They had what they needed. They had the data. They had the proof Mason died for. But Atlas had something too. His location. Ethan closed his eyes once. Then he whispered, "Come on, Ranger." They slipped into the ravine as the mountain behind them shook with the force of another explosion. A line had been crossed. There was no turning back. The ravine swallowed Ethan and Ranger in its frozen silence. But it didn't take long for the mountain to tell them they hadn't escaped far enough. A low mechanical thrum spread through the granite as a drone swept overhead, its infrared sensors slicing through the darkness. Ranger stiffened beneath the overhang of rock, hackles raised, amber eyes tracking the sky with a focus so sharp it looked almost human. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck, grounding himself as much as calming Ranger. They're fanning out, Ethan whispered, tracking heat, footprints, radio noise, everything. And they would find the bunker, if they hadn't already breached it. Ethan exhaled, breath clouding in the cold air. We need high ground, and we need to get eyes. They moved silently through the ravine, climbing until they reached a narrow ledge overlooking the forest floor below. Through the skeletal pines, the first wave of Atlas contractors entered view. 10 men, moving like a single organism. Their leader was unmistakable, Elias Creed. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized him from old briefings, a former special operations officer who had swapped his uniform for the polished brutality of private security. Broad-shouldered, deliberate, always scanning, Creed walked as if he owned the ground under his boots, and tonight he moved with the confidence of a man who believed he was closing in on a loose end. Ethan tightened his grip on the tree trunk beside him. His pulse steadied, sharpened. It had been years since he'd felt this kind of clarity. The fog of PTSD that had stalked him, the grief that had pinned him in place, they evaporated under the heat of imminent danger. He wasn't disappearing anymore, he was preparing. Ranger nudged him, then trotted back toward the mountain wall, stopping at a narrow fissure Ethan had missed earlier. The dog tapped the stone twice with his paw. A small embedded panel lit up. Ethan blinked in disbelief. There's another subsystem? The panel displayed a pulsing map, an interior schematic of the bunker, but more detailed than the one he had used. It showed defensive nodes hidden under the snow, pressure-sensitive plates, camouflaged seismic charges, and more importantly, the status of the jammer. It was active. Ethan glanced down the slope, and sure enough, 2 of Creed's operators were tapping their earpieces in frustration, unable to get a signal. Ranger had triggered the jammer before Ethan even realized they were close enough. You really are the key, Ethan murmured. The dog looked back at him with a steady certainty, as if the comment required no acknowledgement. Below, Creed signaled his team into formation. Their movements were clean, disciplined. These weren't mercenaries hired off a message board. These were elite operators with military backgrounds and corporate funding behind them. Each carried a suppressed rifle, sidearm, and a compact breaching kit. And they were closing in. Ranger suddenly trotted to the edge of the ledge, staring down. Ethan followed his gaze. Creed knelt in the snow, touching a barely visible scuff, Ethan's boot print from earlier. Elias Creed stood slowly, looking around the forest as if sensing eyes on him. Cole, he called out, voice echoing through the trees. Ethan Cole, I know you're alive. Ethan froze. Creed's voice was steady, almost conversational. You opened something that wasn't meant to be opened. We're not here to negotiate. Stand down now, and I'll make sure you disappear painlessly. Ranger let out a deep growl that reverberated in Ethan's bones. Creed chuckled. I know that dog is with you. Interesting choice of courier Mason left behind. Ethan gritted his teeth. Creed's calm tone wasn't confidence. It was calculation. He wanted Ethan rattled. He wanted him desperate. He wanted him predictable. Ethan lowered himself beside Ranger and whispered, We move now. They slipped deeper along the ledge, Ranger guiding him toward a narrow chute in the rock. Ethan recognized the slope immediately. This chute fed into a network of cavities beneath the mountain, the same ones mapped on the emergency schematic. Ranger tapped another hidden plate, and the stone shifted silently, revealing a concealed crawl space reinforced by steel beams. Ethan followed the dog inside. The passage twisted sharply, then opened into a tight chamber lit by faint red emergency strips. It was a defensive control hub, small, hidden, designed for last resort tactics. Panels lined the wall with manual override switches, each tagged with tiny labels written in Mason's handwriting. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Mason had built this for him, for this exact moment. Ethan flipped a switch. Outside, the ground vibrated with a deep, subterranean thud. Creed's voice snapped in alarm through the trees. "Movement! Stay sharp!" The seismic buffer charges had gone off, non-lethal but powerful enough to distort their radar and scramble their search grid. Ranger barked once, short and purposeful, then poured a second switch. Ethan hesitated, then flipped it. Above them, a canopy of snow collapsed from the branches, creating a sudden whiteout. Creed and his team staggered, blinded for a moment. Ethan used that time to reach the far side of the chamber, where a vertical shaft descended into darkness. A narrow steel ladder dropped into the depths. Ranger didn't wait. He leapt onto the ladder rungs effortlessly, gripping each one like he had done it 100 times. Ethan followed. At the bottom of the A shaft, they emerged into a larger access tunnel, the one Mason had labeled in old notes as Route K. It ran parallel to the mountain's outer wall and gave access to the bunker's emergency vents and hidden traps. Ranger sprinted ahead, pausing only when he reached a reinforced blast door with a biometric scanner beside it. Before Ethan could ask how they were supposed to open it, Ranger pressed the pad with his paw. The scanner beeped once. Access granted. The blast door slid open smoothly. Ethan stared at the dog. "Just how much did Mason teach you?" Ranger looked back over his shoulder with an expression that almost resembled a smirk. Behind them, distant but unmistakable, came the muffled voice of Creed giving new orders. "They're rerouting. They've got dogs and thermal on standby. They will not stop." Ethan stepped through the blast door. "Let them come," he muttered. For the first time in 6 years, his voice carried steel again. Ranger moved beside him, ready. The storm outside had reached the mountain, but the one inside Ethan had just begun. Dawn never really came in the Sawtooth Mountains that morning. The sky stayed a bruised gray, heavy with more snow, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. Ethan tightened the strap on his plate carrier and peered through the narrow vent opening above the hidden tunnel. The Atlas strike team had moved quickly after their failed sweep. Now they were deploying heavier equipment, ground-penetrating radar scanners, thermal probes, portable drilling rigs. They were done searching. They were preparing to carve the mountain open. Ranger growled low beside him, ears flattened, nostrils flaring as the cold air carried the metallic scent of machinery and diesel. "They'll breach the outer wall in under an hour," Ethan whispered. He knew this phase, when the enemy stopped playing chess and switched to a battering ram, but Mason had prepared for that too. Ethan knelt beside the stream tunnel entrance, a dark slit in the rock, half frozen, half submerged beneath a sheet of ice as black as obsidian. Ground-penetrating radar couldn't read through moving water. Mason had exploited that flaw years ago. This tunnel was the true emergency exit. Ranger stepped forward first, dipping a paw onto the ice and glancing back as if telling Ethan to move. "You've done this before," Ethan breathed. "Of course you have." He slid into the water. The cold hit like a fist. The shock sucked his breath away, and for a second his muscles seized. But Ranger plunged in beside him, kicking powerfully, guiding him down the submerged corridor carved through centuries of glacial melt. Ethan forced himself to follow the dog, lungs burning, vision blurring as they pushed through the darkness. The tunnel narrowed, angled sharply upward, and finally broke toward light. Ethan burst to the surface with a gasp, clutching the icy ledge. Ranger climbed out ahead of him, shaking his coat and immediately going into a crouch. They were in the hidden grotto, a natural pocket behind a frozen waterfall. From here, they had a perfect vantage point of the canyon. "That's our battlefield," Ethan whispered, staring out at the granite gorge spreading below. Ranger nudged his leg, steady and focused. They moved. Ethan slid behind a dense wall of firs, unpacking the gear he'd carried out of the bunker. A scoped rifle, flashbang modules. The remote triggers for Mason's non-lethal traps still hidden around the valley. Ranger kept watch, head sweeping left to right, tail stiff and silent. Through the brush, Ethan saw the first of the Atlas operatives placing the radar scanner. The circular device swept the ground with a rotating pulse of blue light, mapping the mountain's interior. It wouldn't take long to find the bunker. Ethan anchored the rifle into the snow, lined up his shot, and exhaled. He didn't fire at a man. He fired at the generator powering the drill. The rifle kicked, muffled by the suppressor. The bullet punched into the machine, sending sparks flying and a plume of smoke curling upward. The drill choked and died. The tech operators shouted, scrambling for cover. Ethan was already gone, sprinting deeper along the ridge. Ranger stayed at his flank, his movement fluid, precise, born from training and instinct. Ethan reached another vantage point and fired into the snowbank beside two operators, sending a thunderclap of powder and noise into their faces. They dropped, disoriented, and Ethan hit the remote. A seismic charge detonated beneath them, knocking both men flat. "2 down," he murmured. 8 to go. He worked fast, hitting and running, creating chaos, forcing Creed's team to split up. They were no longer one unit. They were fragments stumbling through snowdrifts, trying to regain formation. But the canyon swallowed sound, bent light, and hid shadows. Every echo turned into 2. Every footstep seemed to come from behind. Ethan's pulse steadied again. This was his element. A second team moved through a narrow choke point between boulders. Ethan timed it perfectly, triggering a hidden strobe emitter Mason had buried under a rock shelf. The sudden burst of blinding light tore across their vision like lightning. The men staggered back, clutching at their helmets. Ethan fired 2 warning shots, one into a tree trunk, another into the snow at their feet. They dove behind cover, panicked but alive. Creed's voice rang across the canyon. "Cole, stop hiding and face me." Ethan's jaw tightened. The last time he'd heard that voice, it had been a distorted echo through a military radio from a man who'd insisted Mason's death was unavoidable. Now Ethan knew better. He retreated higher into the rocks, Ranger guiding him with quick glances and taps of his paw, somehow always sensing which path gave them the upper hand. Below, Creed and 2 of his best men followed Ethan into the canyon's heart, exactly where Ethan wanted them. He waited until their boots scraped the tightest point of the gorge, then stepped out onto a ledge 10 feet above them. "That's far enough," he called down. Creed froze. His men aimed their rifles. Ethan didn't flinch. "You're done, Creed." Creed smirked, voice cold and razor-thin. "You have no idea what you're involved in, Cole. I know Mason didn't die in an accident." The smirk vanished. Creed snapped his hand toward his belt. A knife flashed silver. Everything happened in a breath. Creed lunged upward, using the rock wall to propel himself toward Ethan. Ethan didn't have time to raise his rifle, but something else moved faster. A gray and black blur shot from the side tunnel Ethan hadn't even noticed. Ranger. He launched with perfect trajectory, slamming straight into Creed's chest mid-lunge. The 2 crashed onto the canyon floor, Creed's knife skittering away across the ice. Creed swung wildly, but Ranger was trained for the close fight. He clamped down on Creed's forearm. Not shredding, not killing, but immobilizing, locking bone and muscle in place with unbelievable precision. Creed screamed and dropped the second blade he'd been reaching for. Ethan slid down the rock face, boots hitting snow with a thud. He trained his rifle on Creed's 2 remaining operators. "Drop the weapons." They froze, glancing between Ethan's rifle and Ranger's bared teeth, and slowly lowered their guns. Ranger kept Creed pinned, growl rumbling like distant thunder. Ethan looked down at the man who had orchestrated his best friend's death, the man who thought he was untouchable. Creed glared back, breath ragged. "You think this changes anything?" Ethan stepped closer, voice steady, colder than the mountain wind. "It already changed everything." For a long moment, the only sound was Ranger's controlled, deliberate breathing as he held Creed's arm in an unbreakable grip. And for the first time, Ethan saw something flicker across Creed's expression. Fear, yes, but also confusion. Confusion at how one man and one dog had dismantled his entire operation. He stared at Ranger. "So that's why Mason trusted you?" Creed rasped, to the last breath. Ranger tightened his hold, making Creed wince. Ethan didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Exactly." The mountain was silent after the takedown. No gunfire, no engines, no shouts, just the long, ragged breaths of men who finally understood they had lost. Ethan bound the last of Creed's operators using their own zip ties, stripping weapons, dragging them to a secure outcropping where Ranger stood guard. The dog never took his eyes off Creed. Creed glared back, jaw tight, face drained of color. Every inch of him radiated fury, but beneath that fury was something new: resignation. The first crack in the armor of a man who had believed himself untouchable. "You think this ends with me?" Creed spat. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Truth had already moved into motion. He and Ranger escorted the prisoners down the canyon, guiding them back toward the hidden entrance. There was no need to return to the main bunker. Mason had left something better. A small utility chamber, shielded from aerial scans, containing the last working terminal linked to a satellite uplink. Mason's failsafe. The way he wanted his story to reach the world. Inside, the generator hummed with a steady mechanical heartbeat, vibrating through the stone. Ethan keyed the console on, logged in with Mason's encrypted credentials, and waited for the system to stabilize. On the screen, a single contact blinked. "Secure relay channel, NB77 Boone." Ethan hesitated only a moment. Mason had left instructions. She was the one person outside the military who had earned his full trust. Natalie Boone, investigative reporter for the Republic Ledger. A name known in every defense office, whispered with irritation in every boardroom of every military contractor. She had a reputation for dragging secrets into the sunlight. If there was anyone capable of lighting the fuse, it was her. Ethan uploaded the files: raw intel logs, financial ledgers, black market transmissions, the full decrypted Project Black Summit archive. Evidence so complete and unfiltered that no lawyer, no PR team, no political ally could spin a different story. He attached one final note: for Mason Ward. Make them tell the truth. Then he hit send. The data shot through the satellite uplink like a flare fired into the night sky. Ethan severed the connection instantly and powered down the system. He unplugged every port. He crushed every removable drive and scattered the pieces into the frozen stream. The world outside would burn soon enough. Ranger brushed against his leg, as though telling him it was done. Ethan knelt and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Let's go home," he whispered. But home no longer meant the cabin he had lost, nor the bunker carved into the mountain. It meant something new, something that came to life the second he hit send. They walked out into the cold. Ethan handed Creed and his men over to Valley County deputies responding to the anonymous tip he'd sent earlier. Ranger sat tall beside him the whole time, as if personally overseeing the arrest. Creed glared as he was placed into the back of the truck, his arm still bearing the bruise where Ranger had pinned him. "This isn't justice," Creed snarled, voice muffled behind the glass. "This is treason." "No," Ethan said quietly. "This is truth." And Ranger barked once, low and certain, a sound that felt like a verdict. The next morning, everything changed. News didn't break. It detonated every network, every feed, every trending bar across the country. The Republic Ledger published a full exposé. Thousands of pages, videos, audio logs, financial trails, and Natalie Boone's name branded across the top like a blade. Atlas Dominion, treason for profit. A private military giant deliberately feeding intelligence to hostile forces to prolong overseas conflict. The anchor on the morning broadcast struggled to get through her lines as the studio scrambled with live updates. The Pentagon has issued a formal statement. The Senate Armed Services Committee is demanding immediate oversight hearings. The Department of Justice has executed multiple search warrants. Ethan watched from the passenger seat of an old pickup truck he had reclaimed from a storage locker Mason had purchased years ago. Ranger sat behind him, head resting on Ethan's shoulder, occasionally lifting his snout whenever a new broadcast came through the radio. Atlas Dominion leadership is being placed under federal investigation. CEO Roland Price has been taken into custody. All defense contracts with Atlas Dominion are frozen pending review. The FBI confirms they have detained Head of Security Elias Creed. Ranger perked up at the last line, letting out a short, approving huff. Ethan couldn't help the faint smile. Reporters swarmed outside federal courthouses. Congress members shouted into microphones. Military veterans called into radio shows, telling stories about missions compromised, about friends they lost. Someone asked why the whistleblower hadn't come forward. Natalie Boone answered in a press conference, her voice steady, cutting through the noise. The whistleblower did come forward, 5 years ago. His name was Mason Ward, United States Marine. No one listened, so a friend made sure they heard him. Ethan's throat tightened. Ranger pressed closer, as if sensing the shift in him. His warm fur and steady breathing anchored Ethan to the present. On the following evening broadcast, a final headline appeared. Department of Defense reinstates posthumous honors for Lance Corporal Mason Ward. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The ache he'd carried for 6 long years loosened. The guilt, the failure, the weight of survival. For the first time, none of it felt like chains. Ranger nudged his arm again. Ethan looked at him. "You did this," he whispered, and Ranger lifted his head with a quiet pride that made Ethan's eyes sting. The country was roaring with the news. Justice was in motion. The machine Mason died trying to expose was being torn apart piece by piece. It was over. For the first time since the ambush that had shattered his life, Ethan let out a long breath he didn't know he had been holding. The snow outside the windshield glowed under the first clean sunlight he'd seen in weeks. Behind him, Ranger shifted, laying his head across Ethan's shoulder as if planting a flag. A simple gesture. A quiet promise. It's done. Let's move forward. And Ethan finally believed him. The bunker felt different once the last file had been sent. The air was still the same clean, filtered cold. The walls still hummed with low, mechanical life. But the purpose that had once pulsed through the place like a beating heart was gone. It was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. Ethan stood in the core chamber for a long moment, Ranger sitting at his heel, both of them staring at the console where Mason's world had lived. The screen was blank now, its glow extinguished. Time to put it to rest. Ethan murmured. Ranger didn't move. He simply watched him with that steady amber gaze, the same look that had first pulled Ethan back from the edge of a noose 6 years long. Ethan crossed to the utility panel hidden behind the storage racks. The metal cover was cold against his fingers. He pulled it open. Inside, a single switch waited. Scuttle protocol full system. Self-disable 60-minute cascade. Mason's handwriting was scrawled on a taped note inside the panel. The letters were messy, rushed, but unmistakably his. If you're reading this, brother, you made it. End it clean. Leave nothing behind. Walk out free. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Ranger pressed closer, leaning his weight gently into Ethan's leg. I'll finish it, Ethan said softly. He flipped the switch. A calm voice filled the room. Scuttle protocol engaged. Structural collapse begins in 60 minutes. The lights dimmed to a deep amber. The hum of the servers dropped pitch, shifting into something like a sigh. One by one, the auxiliary monitors flickered off. The HVAC slowed, its steady flow thinning to a whisper. Everything Mason had built, the genius, the paranoia, the hope, was shutting down forever. Ethan walked through the bunker with Ranger at his side. Past the tidy cot Mason had folded with military precision, past the armory where Mason had hung the rifle Ethan now carried, past the pantry stocked for a future Mason knew he'd never see. It all felt like moving through the memories of a man still walking beside him. At the exit, the hydraulic door whirred open on its last breath. The cold stabbed into the corridor, sharp and real. Ethan stepped out into the early morning air. Ranger paused beside him, looked back once into the bunker, then forward again. Together they walked away. The door sealed behind them with a heavy clank. For a moment, silence reclaimed the mountains. Then, deep inside the granite, the first structural supports gave way. Ethan turned just in time to see a controlled rumble ripple through the cliff wall. The ground shook under his boots as a section of rock slid, then folded inward with a muffled roar. A cascade of stone followed, burying the door under thousands of pounds of earth. Within seconds, the entrance was gone. The mountain erased its secret. Ranger sat beside him, watching the dust settle. Ethan laid a hand on the dog's neck. The fur was warm, despite the freezing air. "It's over," he whispered. Ranger exhaled, a calm, steady breath that felt like a confirmation. They made their way down the trail Mason had carved long ago, the same hidden route Ranger had used, to reach Ethan's cabin. Snow crunched under their boots and paws. The first light of dawn brushed the peaks in soft rose and gold. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel the weight of memories dragging behind him. The ghosts were quieter. The guilt no longer gnawed at bone. He had done what had to be done. Mason's story wasn't a whisper in his skull anymore. It was truth, a truth the world finally carried. By the time they reached the weathered pickup Mason had stashed in an old ranger shed, the sun was breaking over the horizon. Its pale light gleamed across the hood as Ethan climbed into the driver's seat. Ranger hopped into the passenger side with a familiarity that made Ethan chuckle under his breath. The dog settled in, facing forward, tail curled around his paws. Ethan started the engine. It coughed once, then rumbled to life. They rolled onto the narrow mountain road as the landscape opened before them. A long stretch of pine forest, untouched snow, and a horizon that promised something Ethan hadn't felt in a decade. Possibility. He glanced at Ranger. The dog met his eyes with a look so calm, so certain, it felt like a sentence spoken without words. Mission complete. Ethan swallowed, throat tight, but the warmth spreading in his chest surprised him. For years he'd driven away from everything. Now, for the first time, he felt like he was driving toward something. He lowered the window. The morning air poured in, biting cold but sharp with life. Ranger leaned his head out, ears flattening back as the wind rushed past. Ethan smiled. A real smile. Honest, unburdened, the kind he hadn't felt since before the ambush in Kunar, before the calls home that stopped coming, before the nights spent staring at the ceiling, wishing he had gone with Mason. Now, with the dog who had crossed a blizzard to find him sitting at his side, he felt something he barely recognized. Peace. He tapped the steering wheel gently. "Wherever you want to go," he said. Ranger looked at him again, then forward, eyes bright and alert as the sunrise spilled across the mountains. Their world had been war. Now it was open road. And for the first time in 6 years, Ethan Cole was ready to live. The memorial lawn behind the Boise Veterans Center was quiet in the late autumn afternoon, touched by a thin veil of gold as the sun dipped behind the pines. A year had passed since Ethan and Ranger walked out of the Sawtooth Mountains with the truth finally unburied. A year since Atlas Dominion fell. A year since Mason Ward's name was returned to the world with the honor it deserved. The ceremony was small, intentional, exactly the way Mason would have wanted it. Veterans, neighbors, a few officials, and the people who had helped carry the story when it mattered. A simple plaque stood at the center of a stone pedestal. Lance Corporal Mason Ward, United States Marine Corps. A friend, a fighter, a man who told the truth. Ethan stood beside it, hands in his pockets, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones the way cold had once settled into them. Except now it was warm, steady, real. Ranger sat at his heel, as always. His coat was fuller, his gait a little slower now that age had begun to soften the edges of his strength. But his eyes still glowed with that amber intelligence that once pulled a broken man out of a blizzard. And when Mason's mother reached out to stroke Ranger's neck, he leaned gently into her side, as though he'd been part of this family his whole life. He had earned his place here. They all knew it. Ethan adjusted his jacket, watching the small crowd disperse towards the reception tent. A few stayed behind. One of them was a young reporter from Northwest Public News, notepad tucked beneath her arm, camera crew trailing her by a few steps. "Mr. Cole," she called as she approached, "can I ask one question on record?" Ethan wasn't fond of cameras, but he nodded politely. "Sure." The reporter stepped closer, the microphone lowered rather than shoved forward, a gesture he appreciated. She glanced down at Ranger, then back at Ethan. "Everyone knows the public side of the story," she said quietly. "The files, the investigation, the fallout. But there's one question people keep asking. Why do you think Ranger went through that storm to find you that night?" Ethan froze for half a second. Not because he didn't have an answer, he just wasn't sure he deserved the right to speak it. Ranger lifted his head and nudged Ethan's hand as if urging him on. So Ethan rested his palm on the dog's warm fur, feeling the heartbeat beneath. "He didn't come for danger," Ethan said softly, his voice low enough that the breeze nearly carried it away. "He came for the truth." The reporter waited. Ethan looked down at Ranger, and something inside him eased, the final lock sliding open. "And to deliver a promise," Ethan continued. "The promise his handler never got to finish." Ranger held his gaze, steady and unblinking, as if confirming every word. The reporter swallowed lightly, the emotion hitting her faster than she expected. She nodded, stepped back, and let her team capture a final wide shot of the man and his dog standing at the memorial of the friend who brought them together. As the crew walked away, Ethan took a slow breath. Ranger leaned against his leg again, grounding him in the moment. "You did good, buddy," Ethan whispered. "Mason would be proud." Ranger blinked once, then pressed his head against Ethan's hip in a quiet, unmistakable answer. The sky above the pines shifted to a deepening blue. Leaves rustled like distant applause. The world was moving on, but it wasn't forgetting. Ethan and Ranger walked toward the parking lot, where Mason's old pickup sat waiting. The air was cool, sharp with the scent of earth and pine. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat with a practiced jump, settling into his usual spot. Ethan paused before closing the door, taking in one last look at the plaque glowing under the sunset. Legacy wasn't something carved in stone, he realized. It was something carried forward, sometimes by a soldier, sometimes by a dog, sometimes by both. He slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life with the same stubborn loyalty it always had. Ranger stuck his nose out the window as the truck rolled forward. The road stretched open in front of them, full of space and miles and possibility. Before the screen fades, Ethan's voice lingers like an echo. If a dog believes in you, you don't get to quit. Not ever. Fade out. A single line appears across the dark screen. What's your story with a loyal pet? Another line fades in beneath it. If you believe these stories should be told, support our channel. Help more people discover the courage, loyalty, and heart of the German Shepherd.